And I like the way that there is, I mean, one of the things about those tea cards that we collected, there was this sort of educational imperative built into them that you'd learn a lot about, I don't know, flags and about different countries and, different wildflowers, all this kind of stuff. And so there was this, this kind of the sort of there was a pervasive culture of improvement, I think, which was it was all around, and of course, it was famously built into the founding principles of the BBC. This Reithian idea of it being, entertaining but also educative.
Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
Were you a good student? I feel like I know the answer to
What do
this,
you
but
think?
I'm being
What do you think?
told. I feel like you studied hard, probably.
I was a full-on, high-achieving, competitive nerd at a public school, or what Americans call public school, in Maryland, in a well-off district with every kind of cliched striving available. And this, friends, is how I became an adult with excellent work-life balance.
How you became an adult is recording this at some ridiculous time when you're in London, having just gotten off a flight. My real question to you, though, is how did you do on your 11 plus, and did you get into grammar school?
Grammar school is like when we were in like first, second, third grade. That's grammar.
Not in the educational system we'll be discussing today. Second and third grade is primary school. Grammar school is a kind of combination of American middle school and high school, and you have to take a test called the 11 plus to get into one. Otherwise, you go to like vocational school or tech school. And did I mention public schools in this system are only for the rich?
Okay, that's the giveaway. I never took an 11 plus exam. I did go to public school that was free and it had rich kids in it, but only because they lived in the neighborhood. And I have enough relatives in London to know that you're talking about the UK.
That's right. And today we get to hear from one of the most respected writers working today about how his childhood in England in the 1960s and 70s shaped him as an author. Geoff Dyer is the award-winning author of many books, including The Last Days of Roger Federer, Out of Sheer Rage, Yoga for People Who Can't Be Bothered to Do It, Zona, See, Saw, and the essay collection otherwise known as The Human Condition, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. After 10 years of living in Los Angeles as the writer in residence at the University of Southern California, he's recently moved back to London. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
After joining us today to discuss your new memoir, Homework, you grew up in Cheltenham, England in the 1960s. Can you talk a little bit about what that town was like then and what it was like to write about your childhood home from the distance of California, or I guess now London? I don't know whether you composed this book in California or London.
Yeah, so it's perceived as a kind of Jane Austen-y middle class town, but that wasn't my experience of it. The book was written in Los Angeles. If I'd been writing a novel set in Madrid, let's say, I'd have had to come to Madrid and have a look around. But of course, there was no need for me to do any research or look around the town because it was completely embedded in my consciousness. Although I did write to the people who are now living at the home I lived in for 11 years, from 1958 to about, I guess, 1969. And they were very, very nice. They let me into the house, and instantly I realized what a mistake that was because, as you know, a place, your experience of a place, your perceptions of it very quickly overlay what it used to be like. And so I realized that by going on this sort of pseudo research trip, I was actually, it was proving to be the opposite of a research trip. It was putting a kind of layer over what were really quite well preserved memories of how it had been.
I was wondering about that because I was born in 67 and I live not very far, maybe a 10-minute drive from the same house that I grew up in. And my mom still lives in it with my father. And so, like, I don't know if I would be able to remember what it was really like when I was 10 or 12 because I've been to that house continually over the last, well, I mean, I was born there and it's 57 years.
Yes, and it's even more dramatic when new people have moved in, because of course what everyone does with a place now is they all expand it from the inside out. So of course kind of walls are knocked down and somehow magically extensions appear and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, so I realized it really had been a mistake. But by then, fortunately, I was quite well advanced in the process.
So I think always of my brother has this habit of going to the house that we grew up in. I was born in 1980, and he goes back to the house we grew up in, and he every few years tries to poke his head in, and he remembers it much more vividly than I do. I remember everything being really tall, and when you
Mm.
go back to your primary school or whatever, and the water fountains are all really low, and just the chairs are very small, and it's not the size of the memory that you have. And so much of what I appreciated about your book, especially in the early sections, were your descriptions, these wonderful descriptions of play and collecting in particular, which resonated so strongly with my own experiences of play and collecting. I mean, in a totally different space and years later. I wonder if you would read one of those sections for us.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that then, because that completely disproves what I claim in the book, that maybe mine was the last generation of collectors. Clearly, it sort of goes on, but I'll give you an example of this. This comes very early on after I've described the various phases that we'd go through in our activities at my primary school. It's the continuity that's important, the way the phases remained essentially the same, irrespective of the seasonal variations or new iterations of a given activity. So while new series of bubblegum cards kept appearing, the business of collecting and swapping remained unchanged. We gathered in little negotiating huddles in the playground, taking turns to flick expertly through our sets, while a potential swapper kept up the rapid accompanying commentary. Got, broken by an occasional excited need. Once the needs had been set aside, the process was reversed, and the kid who had expressed his interest, his need, would rifle through what he had to offer in exchange. Sometimes the result was a simple one-to-one swap, but through the multiple transactions and negotiations at work in the course of the day, an overall exchange rate emerged whereby a given card acquired a more or less standardized value. There was a degree of variation according to how badly an individual needed a particular card, but exceptional transactions like this had a knock-on effect and were thereby incorporated into the volatile workings of the market as a whole. These cards, large, made of stiff cardboard, accompanied by an unwanted strip of pink bubblegum, were commercially bollocks. These cards, large, made of stiff cardboard, accompanied by an unwanted strip of pink bubblegum, were commercially motivated offshoots of TV series. The Man from Uncle, black and white, films, Thunderball, also black and white, and pop groups, or more precisely, the TV series or films built around the Monkees, colour, or the Beatles, black and white. Brook Bond tea cards emanated from a loftier realm of intention. As such, they were collected privately at home rather than swapped, or at least swapping was an incidental rather than defining part of their function. This fitted easily, companionably, with the self-sufficient habits of the only child. Every packet of loose leaf tea came with a card, and every box with two in a little cellophane packet, part of a series of 50, with the subject series changing every 6 months. On the back of each card was a description of and information about whatever was shown on the front, and each series could be glued in an album or displayed on a wall chart. I always chose the album, private, mine, rather than the chart, public, shared. The first set I remember is Freshwater Fish, though that was from 1960 when I was 2, so it's probable that my parents had collected these cards ahead of me. This was followed by African Wildlife, the cover featuring zebra, oryx, and impala drinking in their reflections at the edge of a waterhole. Then came Tropical Birds, a lovely red bird with a pom-pom, Asian Wildlife, tiger, British butterflies, red, admiral, a come down after the last three, Wildlife in danger, turtle, wildflowers, more colourful but also more boring than freshwater fish, Butterflies of the World, Wild Birds in Britain, a robin redbreast, Transport Through the Ages, that was more like it, Steam Train, Ocean Liner, Space Rocket, Trees in Britain, sounds boring, but I loved it, Flags and Emblems of the World, British Costumes, a triptych cover comprising middle-aged woman from the Middle Ages, Renaissance man looking avant-trans, and a chick in a green mini dress. History of the motor car, famous people, bit vague and a portent of what was to come. The saga of ships, the race into space, prehistoric animals, box office, timeless. History of aviation and adventures and explorers. I've no recollection of the sea, our other world, so by 1974 I must have grown out of collecting these, even though as a family we remained loyal to the tea.
Thank you so much. I really loved that passage because I was a collector too. It's interesting as an American how different the collecting was, although I collected baseball cards, but they were very much as you described, where they were stiff cardboard and they had that bad piece of bubble gum in them, you
Hmm.
know. But the baseball card collecting in America has goes back to the early part of the 1900s. I think those cards have been around for a long time. Um, but I was also struck, just like in the descriptions of childhood, I think play is really important. I have two sons who have gone through the periods of play that some of them that you talk about. And I was struck by how free and present you were when you played with other kids. You know, there's a lot of motion and conversation and acting out and the war fighting in the green space or road. Today's play seems dominated by the internet, video games, television. I wonder if you could just talk about the importance of play and writing about play and what you were trying to capture there in those sections.
Yeah, there's two aspects of this. I think one, I was born in 1958, so the Second World War was was over by then. Although it's worth reminding an American audience that rationing in Britain continued into the 1950s because, of course, we were completely bankrupted by it. But the Second World War was so present in the culture, it was being replayed in all sorts of ways, on the TV, in comics, and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, we were all the time playing at war, but the crucial thing is that it was wonderfully unsupervised. Um, so we were just left to not run riot actually, but in the sort of lanes behind our house, where every house had sort of kids, we all just got together, and the play was there was a lot of rough and tumble, but you know, the truth is, we never set fire to anyone. There was never any Lord of the Flies quality to it. So there were injuries and sort of upsets and tears, but no one came to any harm. And also, the school was, let's say, a 10-minute walk away. And after a very early age, the first couple of days, really, we didn't get taken there by our parents. We just all walked there in a gaggle, which was, of course, a lot more fun. So it wasn't this constant sort of terrified monitoring of kids, and it's not, I mean, now there's a sort of fear that sort of paedophiles lurk around every corner. There was none of that sort of stuff. So it was rather wonderfully unsupervised, and no one came to any harm.
There was one per I have to ask him one more question about the play though, because there was one particular ritual that you described that does not have an American equivalent that I wanted to hear you talk about, and that is conkers. Could
Oh
you
yeah.
explain those our
Yeah,
listeners?
yeah. Recently, the Conquers, this kind of game we played as a kids. It made headline news because of some sort of cheating incident. So these were horse chestnut, the nuts, and they would sort of fall from the trees in their spiky shells, and then you'd put a hole through them, tie them to a string, and then you'd have these competitions to try to bust somebody else's conker. And it was always this kind of idea that the harder you hit somebody else's conker, the greater the chance there was of winning. But actually, really, it's in retrospect now, I can see that was irrelevant, really. It was pretty arbitrary whose conker was going to get smashed. And the idea is that the value of your conker, you would inherit, as it were, you would amass all the accumulated victories of the conker you were fighting. So you could, after one sort of competition, you could have a conker that was worth, 200 or something. And then there would be these rather tragic, mad in the sense of mutually assured destructive episodes when the two conkers would destroy each other, and all of that accumulated value, all of the sort of rich history of the civilization of the conquer would be wiped out, and we'd effectively be bombed back to the Stone Age. I suppose there's a parable lurking in that, but I'm not sure what it is.
I want to just point out for our listeners who should definitely pick up this book that one of the epigraphs is from Lord of the Flies, and it is one of the children, I think, saying, "I got the conch."
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, got the, yeah. I should explain that. I'm glad you've raised this because yeah, I liked that. I've got the conch or the conch or whatever, and it's that rule they established that it means you're the speaker in the Senate or whatever. Anyway, I got the conch. 4 words. The Golding estate wanted some phenomenal amount of money for that. And I really, I pretty well despise the heirs of these things who often have done nothing themselves except accumulate money for what their parents have done. So it was a straight choice, either pay up or not use it. And so it was with a great source of pleasure. I said to the publisher, okay, great, we won't use it. So it's gone. That was just in the proof copy.
oh, so it's an
Oh, it's
arc.
in the proof
Oh,
arc. Yeah, we have the
wow.
arcs. Okay, I see. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Okay,
Well,
that is interesting.
we got to read
Um,
something, listeners, that you will not get to read.
that's also interesting because in the U.S., I mean, I've had
That's
this
insane
conversation
to
with like,
make you pay for it
that's
just at the
wild.
beginning of the book. It's just a quote.
It is, and it's not. Or maybe I know what the issue was. It was, I think, under American law, it is fair game, but under
Right.
British law, I would have had to
Oh,
pay.
okay.
And the idea that I'd be paying effectively £50 for a word, three of which were I got there, that seemed, I mean, that seemed excessive. I mean, that's the kind of, it's when somebody's preparing a legal document, you have to pay that kind of money.
I was just
Anyway,
about to ask you
actually,
about the American version because I thought, is it in the American
yeah, actually, it's all worked out so well. So late in the day, yeah, I'm glad this has come up. Late in the day, I decided that I wanted for the I wanted there was a much better quote from Annie Dillard's An American Childhood. So we've got that in the American edition now.
version? Okay. Well, listeners, get yourself to the store. You can find the version that Whitney and I do not have. We will get ourselves to the store as well and catch up on this. But yeah, that's fascinating because but under American law, I guess it would just be fair use.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
That is, it seems like it's a good principle that, yeah. And
yeah.
also crucially, Annie, and even if I did have to pay, which Annie Dillard is still alive. So yeah, and I know her a bit, but yeah, but I don't think yeah. Anyway, so it's all worked out well. I've got a better epigraph.
Okay. Okay. So I mean, it's fascinating that Whitney's talking about this kind of like or you're talking about this kind of the wildness, the unsupervised play, and I just think about the contrast with the kind of really overscheduled, heavily supervised version of play, like also often very digital, etc., or kind of simulated as opposed to actual. But like also out of the play that you described, there are these like mini systems like in Lord of the Flies, like of like kind of self-governance or mini markets. You're like, I was not a collector of baseball cards. I kind of watched my brother do that. I built the card houses and knocked them down, but I wasn't collecting that. And so to kind of see the ways that like commerce or kind of arises, or like these little systems of value, and then they're so quickly dismantled. Um, and so like not only is play a huge part of this book in the loveliest way, but of course the book is also about your intellectual development. We'll talk more about this a little bit because you mentioned a ton of books, which I definitely want to talk about. But In the intro, we were talking about you took what was called an 11 plus exam to get into grammar school,
Yeah.
which was an extremely competitive process. And these schools don't really exist in exactly the same form now. So, for our listeners who aren't familiar with these educational structures, can you explain kind of what a grammar school is and how this has changed to today?
Yes, I thought this would be, or the sort of school stuff would be a source of great confusion because, as you know, here in Britain, when we say public school, that's what you call a private school, and anyway. So yeah, for people who go to state schools in Britain, there was this exam at 11, and it was a sort of IQ test, really. And on the basis of that, you'd go to one of three schools. You'd go to a secondary modern school, which in my case, that was a continuation of the school I'd been at anyway, the same geographical location, or there'd be a technical school, yeah, it would be called the tech, and then at the top for the most apparent for the sort of top percentage, that you would go to this thing called a grammar school, where you would receive a really excellent education, free, provided by the state. And once you were at a grammar school, it was very likely you'd go on to do these exams at the age of eight. At 16, you do O levels. You've got to stay at school till you're 16. And then you'd go on to do A levels. And from there, you'd go on to university. And my particular grammar school, a famously good grammar school, there was such a tradition of people staying on for A levels and going on to university, and not just to university, but to Oxford and Cambridge. So I was lucky enough and I passed the 11 plus, but it's really important to stress something. This all sounds a nicely benevolent thing and a force for social mobility, and it sort of is if you're one of the lucky ones that pass, as I did. But the purpose of the 11 plus was actually was actually the opposite of what it appears. That is to say, it was designed to ensure there'd be a steady flow of kids who didn't pass the 11 plus, who failed, who would continue on to a secondary modern school and go on to trades, apprenticeships, all this kind of stuff, to work in factories and all this kind of stuff. So at the age of 11, if you fail, your options in life are really, really limited. And then actually, for the kids who pass, that's, as it were, the flip side of the real, or a corollary of the other purpose for it. And it's, of course, terrible that your destiny is decided at the age of 11 as a principle. That's awful. Um, but in I can't help but feel a kind of sense of gratitude for this inherently unjust system. And because it was unjust, the Labour governments um, pledged themselves to replacing it with this idea of the comprehensive school, whereby everyone in a certain geographical area would go to the same state school. So they would remove that thing. And that's a nice idea. The great problem is, of course, that comprehensive schools very soon stopped being comprehensive because a certain part, often the most motivated part, they'd be siphoned off into what we would call the public schools, and which and confusingly, you in America, but perhaps more correctly, call private schools. And this kind of antagonism is so sort of crucial to British life. I mean, it's quite distinctive. I don't know, I think in America, you typically, if somebody's been to a private school, you would just say, oh, they went to a private school. But someone like me in Britain, and it's caused me so many problems in America, because I tend to use the phrase public school in a pejorative way. And by public school, of course, what I really mean is private school.
To say that, yeah, yeah, I mean, I'm related to probably hundreds of people in London. And so when I was a kid, I would come over here and my British cousins in their school uniforms would explain this to me and I would sort of scratch my head. And I've had it explained to me many times and I'm still like, why? It's so, I mean, it's such a, it really is the really the class system of British education. The class system of Britain is like so different than what we have in all of the terminology, that I'm still wrangling my head around it all these years later.
Yes,
I
I
can't
think.
get over the fact that it's 11-year-olds where you make that seems so early. I mean, like I'm familiar with the French baccalaureate, which is a really big deal, but that you take at the end of high school and it determines where you're going to go to college.
Yes.
But I have not, I didn't know that I'm not as familiar with the English system. And so that was a revelation to me.
Yeah, and it's so arbitrary, whether it was just, I think it was, I mean, I'm not such a sort of, I'm not deluded into thinking that I showed some great sort of intellectual prowess at the age of 11. I think there's an awful dimension of luck to it, but the separation was absolute, partly because the grammar school was on the other side of town, and I think by the time we'd finished one term in grammar school, we lost touch completely with the kids we'd been at junior school with, and who went on to the secondary modern school.
So your dad worked at Gloucester Aircraft Company. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, Gloucester Aircraft Company. That's where he did his apprenticeship. Yeah.
And your mother worked at the school canteen. So I mean, you grew up working class and then entered this world where you get moved on to this fancier school, and you ended up going to Oxford, which is, of course, arguably the best college in the world. Could you talk about what it was like being a writer and a student from a working class background in these sort of more
Yeah.
uh, exclusive places?
Well, there were a lot of people went to grammar school, and what happened to me at the grammar school, and it really was a fantastic grammar school, is that I started getting into schoolwork generally. But the crucial thing, and it's such a common story, that due to the influence of one particular teacher, I got really into literature, into reading books. We studied Richard III for O level, and the surprising thing in retrospect is how quickly that archaic, difficult nature of Shakespeare's language melted away, and there was a kind of richness to it that I really responded to. And as a result of this teacher's kind of enthusiasm, schoolwork, I mean, particularly doing English. I mean, of course, I still, at the age of 16, I hated maths and all this kind of stuff. But generally, schoolwork went from being something that was a chore and an obligation, and it started to move over to the thing, to taking on the quality of things that I really liked doing, such as listening to prog rock on my record player. And yeah, it just, I think the other thing that we haven't mentioned is I didn't have any brothers or sisters. So a lot of my time at home, I was kind of, on my own and bored. And I think in a way, books, reading, that kind of activity whooshed into the vacuum that had been left by the things I got up to as as a only child, when, I had my sort of toys and all that sort of stuff we were talking about earlier for company. So there was a kind of narrative trajectory there, I think. But yeah, that thing of that that discovery of reading was just a wonderful thing for me. But then of course later on, and this is very, very well documented, the price paid for this system is this kind of thing of moving away from moving away psychologically and in other ways from the world that you were born into.
Yet that there are these amazing moments of kind of like porosity, right? They're the person who gives you the recording of Richard III is one of your mom's coworkers who loves culture, and you talk about listening to it as though it's a deconstructed piece of prog rock.
Well, I was listening to it on the, yeah. So yeah, there was this lady, and she liked culture, and she had this edited down version of Richard III, where Richard III was played by one of those famous Hammer horror actors, either Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee. I couldn't remember which one, but because your ability to get a good grade at O level was dependent partly on how many quotes you could throw in, listening to this meant that I learned practically the whole edited version of the play. I had it all down off by heart. I mean, that really helped me in passing, in getting at the top grade in my O levels. And I like the way that there is. I mean, one of the things about those T cards that we collected, there was this sort of educational imperative built into them that you'd learn a lot about, I don't know, flags and about different countries and, different wildflowers, all this kind of stuff. And so there was this, yeah, this kind of the sort of there was a pervasive culture of improvement, I think, which was yeah, it was all around, and of course, it was famously built into the founding principles of the BBC. This Reithian idea of it being, you know, entertaining but also educative.
Yeah, and there's that it was fast, like when you were writing about Brooke Bond tea cards and the sort of notion of like corporate structures or corporate organizations being invested in public education. I was like, I know the last time I thought of an American corporation caring about whether my kid actually knew anything unconnected to their profit.
Yeah, so it's especially yeah, and of course it was. I mean, there's sort of all sorts of ironies in this, in that, you know, these were cards that came with tea, and of course tea is pretty much as pure a product of empire as you could imagine.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And but I think like so one of for me one of the huge pleasures of reading the book was just um how I got to kind of see you grow up as a reader and consumer of culture. It's one of the great threads kind of stitching the narrative together, like you kind of developing consciousness and taste as a consumer of books and art and culture. You read about, I think the first reference is like Enid Blyton's Secret Seven. And you write about being a kid who wants to, what is it like to go to an X-rated movie? What is it like to your first outing to a pub? And then you have this that a phrase kind of late in the book about schoolwork merging into pleasure, which you were just talking about before. So, what was it like, kind of investigating yourself as a reader and as a young critic at revisiting this kind of chronology of taste and of books for yourself? Like, were you surprised by anything you remembered, or did you re-encounter any book and find it different than you had recalled it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually struck all, I mean, obviously as you progress as a reader, you know, you leave certain things behind. So, you know, I was a keen reader of Alistair MacLean novels, and you know, you really grow out of those at a you know, difficult to read them after the age of 15. But one of the great things this teacher did, of course, so, you know, Shakespeare, Chaucer were on the syllabus. We had to study them quite rightly. And, you know, he made them fun. And then, you know, we go on to other things. So for A level, I think we were reading Jane Austen or whatever it was. But the really great thing he did was to make me conscious of the fact that literature wasn't this thing that was sealed off in a mausoleum. It didn't come to a stop in 1860 or whatever it might be. So he got me to read not exactly contemporary, but more contemporary things. And very interestingly and significantly, that meant actually all these things were American. So what happened to me is that British literature seemed to be old and American literature seemed to be new. And the three in particular, nothing at all unusual about this for someone of my generation. So it was Catch 22, On the Road, and J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. When that's what I was, you know, starting to read, I guess, from about sort of 16 onwards. So yeah, literature as something which was living, not sealed off and dead.
I wanted to go back to your parents a little bit. The book's dedicated to them, among other people. There's a very funny story in there that I liked that reminded me somewhat of my own dad, which was that you guys would have to stop on car trips all the time because he would only fill the tank halfway with petrol, which I thought was kind
Uh,
of amazing.
a sort of a completely pointless economy, that one. Other ones I could, you know, one could relate to, such as, you know, excessively turning off lights. You know, that's a good idea. But all the all that filling up the tank with petrol halfway meant was just we had to spend more time in the garage. It was really, yeah, but
My
yeah.
dad's version of that was that he really was into Jimmy Carter's decision that we should spend less energy. And so we spent like 4 years freezing our asses off
Uh,
every winter. He turned the heat way down
of
until
course,
Reagan
well,
got into office and he forgot about
it's a very different. It's always been different in Britain, though. You know, if you're a bit cold at home, well, put a sweater on.
it, which your mother would make for you.
Yeah, there you
I
go.
wondered if you could just talk about, I've never written about my parents, although I think about them a lot. What was it like writing about them for this book?
I'd written a few things in the past while they were still alive. You know, they were dead by the time I wrote this book. And what I really wanted to do was do justice to them, really. And several things about that. One, to sort of give them all sort of credit, but not to be sentimental about them, and indeed not to be pointlessly nostalgic about this era. And it was strange, really, in that all sorts of things had lodged in my memory for no particular reason. And then, of course, the very act of writing, as many people have said, the more I got into the book, the more stuff came back to me. Now, at that point, it starts overlapping with the sort of language of therapy, but there was no intention of therapy about this. It was just a question of trying to sort of uh, uh, so that the memories sort of come bubbling up, and they're a bit, they might be a bit vague, and then you want them to become clearer, not to get over some trauma or something like that, but really it's just the same process that you have in any kind of writing. That is to say, you want to make the world that you're writing about seem as substantiated, as populated as, and you want to be able to see what's going on as clearly as possible. So that was the effort, a kind of verbal version of concentration, really.
I
And
liked the way that, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't
Oh,
mean to
and
interrupt.
also crucially, not just to come up with an inventory of the past, although I'm aware I have that tendency, but to to make sure there's a kind of narrative propulsion at work using all these details, i.e., that it's not just a meticulously constructed scene, not just a meticulously reconstructed setting, but that there's actually something going on and in progress with all this stuff.
Sugi, I think you should ask the last question. I'll bring my thing in later after you ask it.
Okay. Um, so you also quote and take issue with, there's this line from L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, which many of us, I think, have probably quoted or had quoted as "the past is a foreign country." And then one of the epigraphs of the book, unless this also has changed, is from Raymond Williams' The Country and the City, which talks about kind of being absorbed in one's world, and then as you grow up, kind of turning into someone who observes it. And the last line of that is, great confusion is caused if the real childhood memory is projected unqualified is history. So as you mentioned, this isn't your first memoir. You've written about your life before, but right, not these early years in such detail. But can you say a little bit more about your thoughts about writing about the past, particularly the past as far back as it goes for you personally?
Yeah, actually, it is my first memoir. I mean, first book-length memoir. I'd written essays before, and although,
Yeah.
of course, I've written stuff about my life, I've always felt I was at liberty to sort of alter the facts and shape things for the sake of an aesthetic experience. But I think when you're writing a memoir, the sort of obligation you have to being faithful to the verifiable record is it's much stronger. So as far as possible, it's all true. But it's very much my version of what happened. For obvious reasons, it's not like I was Martin Amis in his memoir, experience, where there's a huge um, archive of written documentary material, because that was the family business, writing. So there was very little documentary record. So I was overwhelmingly reliant on my own memories. But as far as possible, I was faithful to them. And I mean, this thing cropped up recently that was, it turns out that it was proved that I'd got something wrong. But even though it's been proved that I got something wrong, at some level, I insist that I was right, because it's not like I mean, it's just, yeah, because that's how it was. Really, I wasn't trying there. I had nothing to gain by this particular deception. It's just how it appeared to me. The other thing, of course, about the past being a foreign country, and this goes back to something we were discussing early. Earlier I wrote about wrote the book about England while I was in California, And as a result of that, in a way, it just made me very conscious that although I was talking of writing about a foreign country, because I was residing on the west coast of America, it really intensified my sense of the sense of my home where I was from, and also it meant that the kind of England, a country which had sort of driven me mad with irritation a lot of the time, it acquired this kind of retrospective glow as this sort of Blakean Albion. So yeah, it did generate, I don't want to call it nostalgia, but a certain mythic quality to it was I think emerged.
I have
What?
to ask you, have you read, so when I was a kid, and I think the other books of yours that I was thinking of when I was thinking of you writing about your own experiences were things where you had like gone like on the carrier, for example, to write about, you've gone to write about your experiences on a ship. But then when you're writing about your school days, for me, the closest comp, like I grew up as a huge fan of Dahl and like had read, his sort of schoolboy
Oh,
recollections of, and so it really seems to me like for you, it seems like I guess I wonder if you've read that book and what you thought about it, and then also if this project feel to you just like so different from your other nonfiction, because as a reader, it seemed like a different venture.
no, it really is writing. People always, because I've written many different kinds of books, and it's always the same. You just sit there and you're trying to make everything as clear and vivid as possible. And no, it really felt the same. I think it's it's particularly the same as there's no difference really between writing fiction and memoir, um, because the impulse, the necessity always is to make it as detailed and as vivid as possible. It just happens that there is this difference whereby you're really not allowed to extrapolate and to move into the realm of the what could possibly have happened. But I think maybe it was to my advantage that as an imaginative writer, as a writer of fiction, I've always had such a limited imagination anyway, that it's always been quite as it were, a fact-based version of fiction anyway. I'm not one of these writers who can sit down at the desk and imagine that I was at the Battle of Borodino or something like that, which some at least one writer has done famously successfully.
Well, we're coming to the end, so I want to mention something to the listeners that we didn't get to, which is there's some really good grammar school sex slang in here that is British, that's not familiar to me as an American, that I liked. I'm just going to leave it for you to find in there. And the other thing oh, go ahead if you want to comment on that, please do.
I mean, there's a lot of language in the book which, by current standards, is completely unacceptable. I mean, when I'm at junior school, this kid comes up to me and he calls me a homo, a word I've never heard before, and nobody had heard it. I don't know where he got this word from. And then I asked my friend for an explanation of this word, and it's well, let's put it like this: it takes us right back to that historical moment.
Yeah, and the other thing that I liked that I just want to talk about, just say, like, when you're talking about history and we're trying to remember, is that you are in conversation with the reader about remembering. Like you'll
Oh,
sometimes say, "I forgot the word," and then you come back a little while later and say, "Oh, I remembered it. This is what it is," And that I've only ever seen one other memoirist do that, and that was Sven Berkertz in his memoir, My Sky Blue Trade, which came out a long time ago. But I did appreciate that.
it's funny, that thing. We're all familiar with it, whereby you're talking about something and then you can't remember the name. And of course, you strain and strain, and the act of straining seems to bury it more and more deeply in the sort of soil of oblivion. And then you go on talking about something else. And then once the pressure's off, it just pops back into your head. And I think that's, some sort of version of that happens in the writing process. And fortunately, of course, when you're writing, you're not under any time pressure at all. And so, I could have just inserted the name, having left it blank. But I thought the just something about the processes of burial and retrieval was sort of interesting to keep in there.
Sugi, why don't you do the sign off since I asked the last two questions?
Okay. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Well, Geoff, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. And listeners, don't miss homework. Get yourself to your local independent bookstore and pick up that book as well as all of Geoff's other work. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much.